This video is brought to you by Brilliant. At first glance, it looks like America's economy is doing pretty brilliantly. The US has enjoyed better GDP, productivity, and wage growth than basically every peer economy, and the Federal Reserve successfully brought down inflation without triggering a recession, achieving what economists call a soft landing. Now, we've done a fair few videos touching on this topic over the years, and every time we do, we get a whole load of comments essentially telling us that these headline figures about GDP and inflation don't reflect reality, and that ordinary Americans actually have it a lot tougher than the headline data would imply. This sentiment was also apparent in polling. Not only did voters generally not approve of Biden's economy, but voters who cited the economy as one of their top concerns also voted overwhelmingly for Trump. So in this video, we thought we'd dig into this topic a bit more and look at some things that America's headline inflation and GDP figures might be missing. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into it. As we see it, there are at least 3 reasons that America's impressive economic numbers might be misleading. First, cheapflation, second, healthcare spending, and third, debt. Anyway, let's start with cheapflation. In short, while inflation has come down to near the Federal Reserve's 2% target, years of higher than average inflation have still left households with major losses in real purchasing power, and especially poorer ones. An NBER paper from earlier this year found that cheaper items in America have generally seen steeper increases in percentage terms than more expensive items, with the price of the cheapest goods rising by 30% between January 2020 and May 2024. This compares to a 26% increase across the board, and just a 22% increase for the most expensive goods. This phenomenon has picked up the nickname cheapflation, and it's actually pretty widespread. That same paper found similar trends in basically every country they looked at, with the worst cheapflation coming in Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. In practice, this means that poorer Americans, who already struggle most with inflation, have suffered more than the headline data implies, and inflation has therefore been in some sense worse than central banks and governments claim. Anyway, on to the second reason, healthcare spending. In short, GDP is often taken to be the sum of 4 things: investment, government spending, net exports, and domestic consumption. In the US, the largest of these 4 components is domestic consumption, which accounts for about 70% of overall GDP and just refers to ordinary American households buying stuff. However, headline GDP figures tell you nothing about what sort of stuff American households are buying, and when you dig into the data a bit more, it becomes clear that a lot of this headline GDP growth is being driven by increased healthcare spending. Now, because their privatized healthcare system allows healthcare providers to essentially charge more, Americans have always spent a lot more on healthcare than other developed countries. For context, healthcare spending accounts for something like 16% of GDP in the US, compared to about 12% for other G7 economies. Similarly, quite a lot of Americans' recent consumption-led GDP growth has been driven by an especially sharp increase in healthcare spending, which now accounts for something like 27% of household spending, making it the biggest single drain on Americans' personal finances. This healthcare boom has also padded out the jobs numbers. For context, commentators and analysts have been constantly impressed by the number of jobs being created in the US at the moment, and it's something the Biden administration has regularly trumpeted as proof of America's booming economy. However, while it's true that the jobs numbers have been good, something like 40% of all these jobs have come from the healthcare sector. Now, not all healthcare spending is necessarily bad, but the disparity between that American healthcare spending and American outcomes — America has, for instance, the lowest life expectancy in the developed world — suggests that this system is at least deeply inefficient, and it's probably not an unalloyed good that Americans are spending more and more on healthcare, even if it drives up GDP. Anyway, let's move on to the third reason: debt. Again, the issue here is that headline GDP data doesn't tell you how the increased spending is being funded, and there's some tentative evidence that it's being funded by American households taking out unsustainable amounts of debt. The best evidence for this is that credit card delinquencies, i.e. the number of people failing to pay back their credit card debt, have risen to a decade high, and are now reaching levels last seen in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. More generally, the overall amount of debt held by US households is now at a record high of nearly $18 trillion. Around $13 trillion of that is in the form of mortgage debt, and the remaining $5 trillion or so is mostly student loans, credit cards, and auto loans. Given there are around 127 million households in the US, this implies that the average household now has something like $140,000 in debt. Again, in the same way that not all healthcare spending is bad, not all debt is bad, and there are clearly times when it makes sense for households to borrow. However, the rise in bankruptcies suggests that, again, America's debt-fueled spending is not an unalloyed good, even if it drives up GDP. Something similar is arguably also happening with government spending. As we mentioned a second ago, government spending is one of the 4 components of GDP, and increased government spending has been a big contributor to America's overall GDP growth. However, instead of being funded via taxes, which would essentially represent a rebalancing of America's GDP away from consumption towards government spending, this new spending has been mostly funded by borrowing, which is why America's deficit has ballooned to about $2 trillion, representing 7% of GDP. Again, while not all government borrowing is bad, and the European experience suggests that tax-funded austerity can be self-defeating if it ends up undermining growth, the fact that neither Trump nor Harris has any real sense of how they were going to bring down the deficit suggests that it might not be sustainable in this case. All in all, there are clearly ways in which America's headline GDP figures flatter its real economy. Now, to be clear, America has still outperformed other developed economies over the past few years, and American voters' perspectives on the economy have indeed been distorted by partisan sentiments and America's uniquely polarized media landscape. Today, for instance, whether Americans think the economy is doing well or badly depends almost entirely on whether or not their preferred party holds the presidency. And Democrats and Republicans' sense of how the economy is doing have already started reversing since Trump won, despite the fact that he hasn't even taken office yet. Nonetheless, it's at least true that the headline economic figures are in some sense misleading, which partly explains both why voters generally disapprove of Biden's economy and why talk from politicians and central bankers about America's economic boom wasn't well received by much of the electorate. As you've hopefully realised after an 8-minute video explaining the current state of the US economy, you'll have noticed that here at TLDR News, we're committed to helping you learn. Fortunately, the sponsor of today's video shares this commitment and is one of the best websites on the internet to help you learn new skills from the ground up. That website is, you guessed it, Brilliant. Now, one of the best things about Brilliant is, rather than simply throwing information at you and testing you on it, Brilliant teaches you by doing. Each of their lessons is filled with hands-on activities in problem solving that helps you actually play with the concepts. This is proven to be 6 times more effective than simply watching lecture videos. And what's more, Brilliant actually helps you do all of this learning wherever you are. You can complete their lessons on your phone, so you can easily utilize any spare minutes you have in the day with actually worthwhile learning. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. So click on the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching the video, and thanks for Brilliant for supporting this video.